Welcome, Pete. Tell us a little bit about who you are, a little bit of what you do, and why
Yeah,
Christian fasting is important.
absolutely. So I guess you could say I'm a Christian emergency medicine physician. I've been working in ERs for the last 8 years or more. And, my shifts can be day, night, holiday, weekend, etc. And so sickness and suffering happens all the time. We have to be ready. And one of the interests and passions I have in addition to medicine is sort of preventative medicine, which, comes down to lifestyle and diet. And I'm also very passionate about my Greek Orthodox Christian heritage, and I think it's important that sometimes we merge these two worlds of the religious and the scientific, of the secular and the religious. And one of those great intersections, I think, can be fasting, this art of fasting. And there's a lot of universal practices that are out there about this tradition. But I will say there's a particular way to do it when you're a Christian. And I think what's so interesting about that approach is that when you do Christian fasting right, not only are you certainly molding your spirit in the right direction, but you're also getting true healing of both soul and body. And as a doctor that really understands this, what the stakes are all about, I wrote a book to try to help people get a little closer to God and a little bit healthier in the process in doing so.
That's incredible. I mean, that's a background I've it's really new to me. So, talk before we go into maybe like the spiritual sides and more in depth of fasting. I'm fascinated by like what does it mean to be Greek Orthodox? How is that different in Christianity? How have you lived it? Like what? Like, I have no idea. So how would you
Yeah,
say is different Christianity?
the way that I would introduce Greek Orthodox Christianity is that it's one of those historic, ancient churches that has been there from the beginning. And I don't just say that as a buzz phrase, but it really is the language that the Bible was written in. Our priests look like the people at the First Nicene Creed that put together the Bible. We are a Christian group that has a hierarchy, but I call it a soft hierarchy. So we don't have a pope, but we have lots of patriarchs, and
Mm.
they're sort of leaders of regions across the world. And in fact, I think there's about 300 million of us across the world, with a
Wow.
handful of patriarchs. But there really is no papacy as what's present in the Roman Catholic world. However, we do hold a lot of traditions with them because for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, we were just the same church. In 1054, there was a schism, and we ended up creating an Eastern form of Christianity called Orthodoxy, and a Western form of it called Catholicism. So, the church now, as it stands, being Greek Orthodox, is one of many different Orthodox churches that just have different ethnic names. So you can be Greek Orthodox, and that means you speak Greek in the church. You can be Romanian Orthodox, that means you speak Romanian. But theologically, it's all the same. And one of the really unique practices of being Orthodox, at least for my mother-in-law's perspective, because my mother-in-law is from Poland, she's as Catholic as it gets.
Mm.
But what she doesn't quite understand is this idea of fasting. Why would you ever fast? Do you hate yourself? Is there something wrong with you? And the reality is that maybe there's a truth to all things, but the point is that in fact Christianity was heavy on the fasting for a very, very long time. And I would say now that there are tens of thousands of different Christian groups and different denominations, if you kind of go back to the early church, fasting was a universal for that phase of the church. And Roman Catholics, I would say, have largely forgot fasting, and the Orthodox Church still utilizes it. Although you can imagine people are still resistant to it because to some extent it's difficult. But one of the reasons I think it is more difficult than it has to be is because over the past 2,000 years of optimizing that fasting practice, sometimes we can kind of forget what parts and pieces are supposed to be done at the same time so that it is easier. And that's what the Athos Diet is. So the book that I wrote is called The Athos Diet. It is a book based on fasting principles in Christian monasteries throughout the world, but specifically in a place called Athos, Mount Athos, which is a peninsula in Greece. And these people have been outliving modern civilization for 1,200 years. They're outliving us now. They outlived this 1,000 years ago, and they will continue to. And what I did is not only look at what they eat and how much they eat, but when they eat. And between these three prongs, we've created sort of parameters to help Christians fast so that they get both healing of both soul and body in their efforts.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's incredible history. And okay, so let's dig in a little bit more into the fast, but I want to tell you real quick my example, and then maybe you can either, give me tips for the next fasting I do. But my example is I had no connection to fasting whatsoever. Other than maybe growing up and, hey, we're going to fast for a day, the entire church, maybe 3 days, and, do it with spiritual purposes. But my wife, she went fully into fasting for like 3 years ago, and she's done multiple 21-day fasts. So we recently finished one of those 21 days. I joined her for the first time.
Wow.
And it's been super surprising. Not only the focus that I was able to attain, like some doctors describe it as the brain fog goes away. That's real. That's true. And it's just like, okay, and then you're listening from the Lord, and everything becomes more clear. Maybe next steps you need to take in your life. So I can see the spiritual benefits and even the physical benefits to it. And coming into it, I thought, how am I going to do this? 21 days sounds like a lot. And then as I dug a little bit more, right, and maybe you can let us know how maybe some principles as we approach fasting from a Christian perspective, because I know some people, and especially in the Orthodox tradition, maybe they fast for 40 days, for even 50 days. And when I learned about the tradition of the church doing this, is the church used to do it for centuries and centuries, where they would fast even, leading up to Easter. They would fast throughout the year, at least twice a week. I'm like, I can't imagine all the things we're losing as Christians if we're not doing this, right? If I experienced it in 21 days, the first time in my life, and I've been experiencing breakthroughs at all levels in my life, I'm like, wow, this is significant. We got to look more into that. So this is like a God thing that we're speaking today. So we're just speaking to that, like what are maybe some good approaches as we go into fasting? And we have no idea. We think like, how am I going to do this? 21 days, 40 days. How do I even start?
Well, let's talk about some definitions, because, fasting is a term that has a lot of different meanings. I mean, certainly fasting can be purely something like, hey, I'm not going to eat certain types of foods, where you get rid of whole food categories. I'm not going to eat, processed foods for a month. Okay, that could be fasting. Another form of fasting could be you only eat during a certain period of the day. That's more of an intermittent fasting approach, but you don't really care how much you eat or what you eat. And then, of course, there's other types of fasting where not only are you interested in what types of food you're eating, but when you're eating and how much you're eating, and combinations of all these three. Historically, if you look at sort of Judeo-Christian history, there was a Daniel's fast, a prophet Daniel's fast, where he ate much of nothing except, I think it was like raw vegetables and water for weeks. There are other examples where Moses, didn't eat anything. Christ himself fasted from food and water, actually, for 40 days, the story goes. And of course, David himself, when he came across the prophet David, many different issues or difficulties in his life, he would fast no food, no drink for days. And everyone seemed to sort of associate that practice of fasting with some spiritual insight. But it wasn't until 2024 or 2025 that through sort of a scientific lens, we could kind of see why the practice of fasting would translate into introspection and to increased energy and to sort of maybe even a superpower per se. But, maybe just to give a few quick examples in the modern times, what people do for fasting, like Roman Catholics before Lent, or for Lent rather, before Easter, oftentimes will give up something. Hey, Doc, I'm going to give up chocolate for the month. I'm going to give up soda for the month, something like that. There was an old tradition where people would only eat fish on Fridays. The Greek Orthodox Church has been really into fasting for a long time. And so the standard protocol for fasting for a Greek Orthodox Christian is that you are not eating anything that contains meat or dairy inside of it. Wednesdays and Fridays, just all year long, Wednesdays and Fridays, 40 days leading up to Christmas, 48 days leading up to Easter, several weeks over the summer, in June, and then many more weeks in August. Basically, it turns out that Greek Orthodox Christians are fasting almost like in this pescatarian/vegan style more than half the year. It can be up to 2/3 of the year, depending on that year. And so, we started our faith at the age of 7 doing this. And so you might say to yourself, oh my gosh, that sounds really extreme. What's going on? Well, there's a lot of reasons why we start early, and there's a lot of reasons why fasting is so paramount to being an Orthodox Christian. And the reason is, and I can tell this from a scientific standpoint, is that when you really look at what is to be human, what is our core, you might close your eyes and touch your head. But when you really look at what the largest nervous system is of the body, it's actually not our brain. And there's ways to describe it to prove that point. But like, your brain is only so big. Your intestine is huge, just by physical space. So when people say, hey, go with your gut, I have butterflies. I just met this girl. My stomach hurts. I have this thing going on. My belly hurts. That's your nervous system talking to you. In fact, it's called the enteric nervous system.
Wow.
And the enteric nervous system is physically larger than your brain. It has more neurons than your spinal cord. It is more complex. And at the same time, it manages these two branches of the nervous system called the sympathetic and parasympathetic. I only bring this all up to say that to not manipulate, to not be aware of, to not press the buttons of our intestinal system, of our enteric nervous system, is to completely lose the mark as to how to change ourselves fundamentally. And, culturally, there's nothing more important to a culture than its food. It's interesting to me that in Christianity, communion is such a huge sacrament of the faith, or mystery of the faith. It is a food. And when you have someone over to your house, you break food with them. Like, it's not like you just play music or you do something like that. It's always surrounding food. And the reason for that, again, is because the enteric nervous system is massive. It's sensitive. 30% of our energy every day is just needed to digest food. So it's a huge machine. And then, of course, there's 100 trillion bacteria that live in our intestine. That's more bacteria than cells in your entire body. So all of this comes back to say that the reason in the Christian faith that fasting is so important is because if you want to truly transform and change yourself, you need to be worried about when you eat, what you eat, and how much you eat. And so this book called The Athos Diet is trying to take best practices, as I mentioned, from these monasteries where people are outliving a lot of people, and bring that to the Christian masses. And specifically, these monks at Mount Athos, they have this practice every day of, one, always being prepared for death, because we as Christians know that this life is transient, that death is coming. You never know when it will come. And as an ER doc, I can tell you there's a lot of unexpected things that happen every day. But because of these monks taking that seriously, these monks not only are preparing, let's say, spiritually, but they are also getting ready to go to liturgy or to mass every day, and they don't eat prior to taking communion. So they won't eat until the late morning, early afternoon, and then they'll only eat a few hours a day. So not only do we care about what they eat and how much they eat, but when they eat. And another tradition, apart from this one of fasting until communion every day, which they strive for, is two, they fast with Christ until he died at the 9th hour. That's 3 p.m. And so a lot of these monks over the centuries have been intermittent fasting without realizing it. It was just part of their culture, their tradition, their prayer life. And the reason that's important is because if you intermittent fast every day of your life, that means you're only eating calories for no more than about 8 hours a day, but you can always go less than that, but no more than 8 hours a day. Every mammal that does that lives 30 to 40% longer.
Wow.
So this is really powerful because as a result of this practice, which of course starts out as a Christian principle, it's an axiom. Because of this spiritual thing, because of this principle, I'm going to subject my body to something else. And as a result, God takes care of us. And it's like, hey, you're going to prepare your soul for death. You're going to prepare for communion every day. You're going to, pursue confession and do the right thing and prepare your soul and forgive your brother and all these things. All this comes with the territory. Well, now suddenly we're getting ready for communion every day. And every day you're intermittent fasting. And as I said, when any mammal does this, they live 30 to 40% longer. And so, that's just topic sentence. And what I do in this book is I show how intermittent fasting, for example, there's two other prongs to the Athos diet too. But for the first prong, for the first pillar, this intermittent fasting portion, I show how scientifically, medically, that actually works out as a longevity exercise.
Wow. So, yes. This is fascinating. I'm taking some notes as you're speaking, because I think one of the strongest calls for the Christian, and we can see this in the fruits of the Spirit that, God invites us into, one of them is self-control, right? So again, even just from my own experience in the last few days, as I went through my own journey of fasting, I've experienced, there's a lie out there in our society, in our culture. It's not spoken of, but the lie is, I can't do this. It's almost like you're a victim of your own desires, right? And I think fasting, to me, it has been an introduction to self-control, which is one of the fruits of the Spirit. And I think, what a better way to introduce self-control than with something that our bodies, we think, my body needs food, and it's true. But I love that, as you're talking about this Athos diet, yes, it does need food, but can you control when and what and how?
And exactly. And because we're doing that with food, and because we're interacting with the enteric nervous system, and we're changing ourselves fundamentally in doing that, when you talk about delayed gratification, disciplines, consistency, being in, having dominion over your body, that will change you spiritually as well. Like, what horse are you going to bet on to say no to when they're feeling, temptations to abuse drugs or abuse women or to get angry? Is it going to be the person that, has never fasted, or the person that has fasted and every hour of the day for many decades has had that feeling of, I want to reach for this thing, for this impulse, for this something that makes me almost irrational. Like, I just have to eat this food. But the reality is that when people fast and they're like, oh my gosh, doc, I don't know if I can get to, this next hour. The reality is that most people have enough fat on their body to go about 3 months without food.
Wow.
And in fact, the guy that lasted the longest without any food whatsoever lived over a year. So it's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous that we are living in such the modern age, and we don't know our own strength, our own superpowers. But I'm telling you that it is a superpower. And one of the reasons I recommend fasting for children, and again, fasting is a generic word, and we have to be careful, because I would not recommend a 7-year-old going 40 days without food. Okay, that's not what I'm recommending. I'm recommending they do the Athos diet. But what I recommend in the book is that people eat no more than 8 hours a day, but they can get down to 4 hours. That's preferred, but no more than 8. That they're trying to eat as much protein as they can get, but it's from a plant-based source. And then finally, in regards to exercise, they're just walking no less than 30 minutes a day. When you do these three things, you will heal both soul and body. And one of the things that the Orthodox Church, or this Christian church, has been recommending is that people start this practice at the age of 7. And you might say to yourself, "Oh my gosh, that sounds really extreme. Shouldn't they be, developing, and we shouldn't be worried so much about all these things?" Well, I can answer that with two quick responses. One is that we have a healthcare crisis in America, where because we aren't really caring about our children's health, children now are getting diabetes, high cholesterol. They're supposed to get screened for these things at 10. And some of them are even going on drugs like Ozempic to try to lose weight. It's pretty extreme. So rather than putting kids on prescription drugs to help them lose weight, I say, why don't we just reintroduce Christian fasting? Because we are a Christian country.
Wow. And
these children could benefit from that. I think this is really important to highlight. There's this study called the ACE study. And the ACE study took young children, they watched them over many decades. There's like 10 to 20,000 of them, watched them over many decades. And they found out that some percentage of these children lived about 20 years younger, 20 years, let me put this way, they died 20 years younger than the rest of everyone else. And they started to look at this group and try to figure out why that is. Well, it turns out that when children are exposed to adverse childhood events, that's what ACE stands for, adverse childhood events, that includes people fighting each other, drug abuse, pornography, being neglected, being abused, assaulted, their body and their life manifests from this trauma in true disease later on in life. They are more prone to alcoholism, to drug abuse, to divorce, for unemployment, for cardiovascular disease. Literally, the body keeps the score. So I view these things as a child, and suddenly I manifest these things as trauma and as poor outcomes and coping mechanisms in the rest of my life that literally translates ultimately to an early death. And I bring this up to say that if we know from the ACE study that bad things can make a child manifest bad things the rest of their life and truly shorten their lives, then what is the power of doing something good at a young age do for them? And one of those good things I think that we should incorporate into their lives is fasting. Because if I can teach a 7-year-old delayed gratification, self-empowerment, how to say no, how to be disciplined, how to understand sort of the longer time horizon, quality over quantity, what wonderful things will they be capable of doing? Not like later on in life, just say, but even then and throughout their lives. And it's very true. It's very true. And I think that's why we all inherently feel this need to protect children, because we know that those formative years really do manifest as good or bad outcomes later on in life. And so, in my opinion, being a Christian nation and trying to incorporate Christian fasting is already at a young age, if we just chose to use this tool, could save us from a lifetime of addiction, from relationship problems, from issues with gaining too much weight because we're gluttonous, or seeking after women because we have lust, or being lazy because we don't have the discipline to kind of keep the routine going. And so all of this is, in the wisdom of the church, is one of these universal reasons, or one of these reasons why this universal practice of fasting should be used as a Christian as early as possible. Well, and in the tradition of the church, it's about 7 years of age.
Wow. That's amazing. Okay, is there any negative way to fast? And I'm trying to find. I know there's kind of like a story in the Bible, and I can't right now. It's not coming to me where I can point you to it. But there's a few verses where I remember it says something along the lines of like, some people committed to not eating until they would take down the enemy, right? In this case, the Israelites. Is there any way in which people can take fasting, but almost with an evil intention, and saying, I'm going to abstain from food so that I can, just fulfill an evil purpose?
Well, you could say this, why does a man prepare his body to attract a woman? Is it so that he can get married and have children and be a king of his little kingdom? Or is it so he can just screw around with as many people as possible, avoid all responsibility and duties? So you can see, these tools are superpowers, and we have to make sure that we use them in the right effort, for the right trajectory, the right purpose. But I'll respond with two ways about this question you bring up, which I think is a good one. Yeah, there's this tradition in the old days of, hey, I'm not going to eat or drink until I've completed this vow. And I think there was even a group of Jewish people who were trying to kill St. Paul at one point for that same point, or that same approach. Hey, we're not eating or drinking until we kill St. Paul. Of course, he escaped. But I'll say this. One is, we don't want to become anorexics. That's a real disease. There are a lot of women out there that struggle with that. Exceedingly rare in men, but it's somewhat more common in women. But it's interesting to me. They are intermittent fasting. I mean, one of the reasons I think we should not necessarily just completely tell them, hey, you're doing something wrong, is like, well, they do have discipline. They do know what delayed gratification is. I don't want to rob them of that, but we do need to rein in their sins of the left and sins of the right. We need to rein in their goals so that it actually becomes a healthy thing instead of something that breaks them down. And so the Athos diet, as I said, every day you are breaking your fast every day. You're only eating between 4 and 8 hours a day. As a doctor, if I was taking care of an anorexic patient, I would tell them they can keep fasting, but you got to eat once a day. and that's got to be filled with nutritious foods. And so in that way, I'm not telling this person with this gift per se to shut off a whole portion of who they are. In fact, I think the only reason that they are able to sustain themselves for such a long time as being anorexic is because there's some benefit to it, both spiritual and physical. But we as mentors and as docs and as people who have been through this need to help them understand the goal. And it's interesting to me too. I've never met an anorexic person who's doing it for God. I mean, I always thought that was interesting, right? They're never saying, "Hey, I haven't eaten for X amount of days because I'm trying to connect with my Savior." It's about them, which is interesting. That's an interesting that's not a coincidence. So anyway, but as I say, one way or another with the Athos diet, every day you are eating all the necessary food you must. Now, you might be in caloric deficit. It might be a particular type of food, in this case, plant-based protein, but you are eating every day. And so for people who are anorexics, I would say, hey, I don't want to take your superpower away, but I need to re-guide you. I need to redirect you in a slightly way. And then for the person who is fasting and now has all these powers, we got to make sure we're doing it so that you can lift up the weak, so that you can support your community, so that you can get spiritual insight. And it's not just for like a six-pack on the beach. And of course, if the six-pack comes, then by all means, no problem. But that's not the reason we're doing it. And as a physician, as a doctor who sees suffering every day in the ER, I just worked 5 night shifts in a row, and I'm coming off my night shifts here. But the reason I bring this up is I understand that the stakes are so much higher than just vanity at the beach on the summer. We're talking about the difference between life and death, the difference between making it to Christmas and to Easter this year to be with your family. I've buried plenty of people on Christmas Day. People get heart attacks all the time. Isn't it interesting that in the wisdom of the church, you're supposed to fast for 40 days for the one and 48 days for the other holiday? There have been studies that show that if you have coronary artery disease and various other ailments, you can reverse a lot of those risk factors in as little as 30 to 40 days. So again, it's like you think the church is just trying to make you do something for the sake of, I don't know, some like happy, go fun, kumbaya moment. It's not. It's literally them trying to say, do you want to be there with your family for Christmas this year? Do you want to avoid that heart attack, that stroke, that spike in sugar that might make you go into DKA? I mean, all of these things. And so in the wisdom of the church, it's like, hey, here's the salve, and it's called fasting.
Wow. That's so intense. So I have and it's kind of funny because on our website, christianpodcast.com, we have a club that we started and we're calling it Theophilians Club, those who love God. And, I mean, this comes from the Greeks. I'm like, wow, that's so interesting that today we're talking about this topic. And I want to invite people to go check that out because the next question, I'm going to put it on our website, on our exclusive page for Theophilians, those who love God, right? That's what it means. And it's just a fun way, for people who love God to be a part of our website and journey and community and get exclusive content. But, one of the questions I want to ask is as it relates to what you're saying, the superpower. I mean, I think that's a great way to put it because we're in America where, the stories about superheroes is the ones that we go watch on the cinema, right? The Hollywood hits and stuff. We always want to be the superhero. And it's so interesting that in America, we want to attain these high levels of power, right? I mean, that's really what it is, right? What would it mean for me to have this superpower, right? And we can think about many ways in, flying over the air, rays coming out of your eyes or whatever it might be. But in this case, you're saying the church has a superpower. And I would love to ask you, what's the relationship with, when Jesus says some type of, he uses the word demons, and maybe you can elaborate on what that means, evil spirits, right? But when he says some sort of spirits don't come out without prayer and fasting, I mean, that takes a superpower.
Yeah, no, well said, amen. I mean, it's funny you bring up this passage because this has everything to do with fasting. I'll give you a reason for that. 100 years ago, Dr. Conklin read that same verse about basically God casting out the demon from a man who was an epileptic.
Mhm.
And remember, so the apostles go over to heal him. They can't do it. He still has his seizures. And then finally, Christ comes over, heals the epileptic. And what happens next? They ask him why they couldn't do it. And he says, hey, some of these things just can't be solved without prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting.
Mhm.
So Dr. Conklin takes this seriously. He takes 20 plus epileptic children that no one can heal. And he says, you know what, guys? You're not going to do anything except eat water and vitamins for the next so many weeks. And guess what happens? The seizures went away. The
Wow.
seizures went away. And in fact, this is because they switched from a source of burning sugar for fuel to ketones. And that's